Hello there, hope all is well. Good to see you all and thanks for tuning in. I haven't done a video for a little while. I've been doing a lot of live speaking events, which has kind of prompted some of the content of this video. So I was talking a couple of weeks ago in terms of data privacy and what it means for communications professionals. I've been talking about data protection and what that means to small businesses, advising a few SMEs, all that sort of stuff. And one thing that struck me is that the role of a lawyer, at least the role of a lawyer as I see it, is not necessarily to be mean to people, which some people think. It's not to try and stifle competition or somehow make things difficult for someone who's trying to do business. It's essentially to make sure that people keep within a legal framework, that they don't do something that they shouldn't, that they make sure that when they're entering into relations, in whatever those relations may be, with a customer, with another party, they're doing it on the right track and they understand what they're getting into. And the understand thing is key. Now, there's not been much good news in the world of technology law recently. The tech war continues between the US and China, so we still have issues about what will be sanctioned and what won't be. I can't see that changing anytime soon. And big tech is well and truly under attack, and it seems that it is competition and antitrust law that is the way forwards in that approach. So I wanted to talk about something a little bit lighter, which came to my mind when I was trying to explain what the law means to people who are non-lawyers. And that made me think. Let me show you something. This is outdated. We now do all these things online. We don't use books. This is a legal reference guide, really, a textbook, more of a reference guide to information technology law, my area. It's a weighty tome. This is volume 3. I think volume 4 is still in the library, even though this is an old book. And most legal texts are quite unwieldy, large, I suppose, books, for want of a better word, or large files these days on the internet, large things for you to read online through an online search facility. And certainly when I spent many years ago when I was doing my law degree and when I was qualifying as a lawyer, my college room was full of these quite expensive textbooks, which were very, with some exceptions, some notable exceptions, very dry and oftentimes hard to understand. Most of my tutorials when I was at college were spent having read vast numbers of legal cases, then trying to explain to a tutor who was often very frustrated with me what those cases actually meant and what the detail was that was important, which is often hard to ascertain. And again, most of my role as a lawyer is taking all that information, making sure that it's up to date and explain to a client in the most layman terms imaginable what the law means for them. Which got me to thinking. And I was having a discussion with a good friend of mine about this, and it brought me on something of a movement, I suppose. What if law itself was easy to understand? What if actually you didn't need the equivalent of a law degree to understand terms and conditions? Now, if you read an end-user license agreement, or if you read, let's use Facebook, I'll pick on Facebook as a good example, but Apple's a good one too, actually. If you look at their terms and conditions, I bet you haven't read them. I have read them, but I haven't read them since they were last updated, so technically I haven't read them, so I don't really know exactly what's in them now. Reams and reams of legalese, lots of terms you might not understand. For example, you probably don't realise that by using certain products, if you have a dispute, you've got to go to arbitration in California. I'm pretty sure the majority of people watching this didn't know that. But these things are not easily accessible documents and they're not easy to understand. And there is a movement, very much a movement, and it's starting to gain traction, not just in terms of the legal profession, but generally it's getting a wider fan base, if you like, of trying to make law and essentially law documents, understanding the law, more accessible to the normal person. Not suggesting that lawyers are abnormal people, but you know what I mean. Now, this is something called legal design, and it's cool. It's taking the principles of good design, of making something attractive, easy to understand, something that catches your eye, for want of a better word, and apply it to legalese, to legal documents. Now, why is this important? You want to be able to understand something that governs the way you live, the way you work, or the way that you do business. You don't want to. A good example, actually, is the GDPR. I'm sure a lot of people here will have read the GDPR, and it is one of my, you're going to think, God, he's boring, one of my favourite data protection laws in the world. There was some talk that it needs updating. Yes, it probably does. It will always need updating. But if you try and sit down and read it, let's just say it's not exactly a page turner. There's a lot of pages to turn, but it's not exactly something that you're going to be very excited to go through. Maybe when you get to the fines, but you think, oh, this is a bit scary, but there we go. Wouldn't it be great if we had some sort of simple guide to the GDPR where the actual law was explained in diagram form, in clear, crystal clear language how it would work? Now, people have created that, but imagine if the law itself took that approach, if it was deliberately easy to understand. Now, legal design is trying to do this. It's taking legal documents, taking legal frameworks, taking laws themselves, and presenting them, for example, in the form of a flowchart, in the form of essentially a mind map of what's relevant to what. But imagine, rather than having to read clause X, clause Y, clause G, I was looking at the Hong Kong employment ordinance recently, and we get to 32J, having read all of the other 32s, you think, God, this is really hard to follow, and it shouldn't be. And considering that it applies to individuals, to employees, imagine if instead that was presented as a simple to follow guide to work through. Now, legal design teams, and they are cropping up all over the world now, are trying to solve this problem. It's trying to make essentially law, the understanding of the law, and the documents that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, something that are not only easy to read, pleasant to read, and you can instantly understand them without consulting a lawyer. Now, you may think, Haswell, you fool, why would you want people not to be able to consult a lawyer? Well, ultimately, I will help people when something goes wrong. I will help people understand things, but I shouldn't have to help the average person in the street who just wants to understand, for example, what will happen to them if they pay their taxes slightly late, what will happen to them if a contract of employment is breached, that sort of thing. It should be something that we can all essentially enjoy, and law essentially becomes less of this arcane thing that people are a bit scared of and scared to understand, but actually becomes the sort of thing where actually, you know what? Lawyers aren't that bad. They actually seem to be helping me, and I understand the sort of things and the frameworks they're operating in. Now, I've been involved in some pretty hefty legal negotiations and indeed some pretty hefty litigation and arbitration cases. And the legal negotiations in particular stick out for me as being a battle of wits in some ways, as people try and outsmart the other by using some loophole within the drafting or creating some loophole within the drafting that will possibly help one side or the other later on. And it is still, in many cases, quite an adversarial approach. People seem to take the litigation principles and apply them to contract negotiation, even though ultimately two parties want to do some sort of deal. They've brought the lawyers in to enshrine it, and then the lawyers start fighting. If we could actually do away with all that through legal design, think about it. You essentially have two parties, they have a concept, they both have what they think something will look like, they combine it and work together with a legal design team to essentially create a contract that everyone can understand and be happy with. I think it would be a game changer. Now, I'd like to give some examples of what legal design could look like. You don't have to think of it as just, I'm using flowchart because I think it's the easiest thing for people to grasp. You could have it as an online contract, a contract that works by clicking through various methods. Rather than reading a long end-user license agreement, it explains to you the basis of each term. It gives the term in clear, plain, easy to understand language and tells you what the consequences are of each bit. It up front explains to you what potential liability might be. It's often at the back of a contract, and actually often your liability and what happens when goes wrong is something goes wrong is what you need to know at the beginning. But it would again do this in pictorial form, in simple to understand diagrams. Essentially something you can click through, understand, go back, and then you get a record of what it means and a summary at the end. Contracts, for example, typical contract, particularly a more complicated one, may have a few recitals at the beginning. Recitals are basically where you give the background to why the contract exists, and then they launch straight into essentially legalese and jargon. Now, in the UK, there was a campaign to essentially present legal documents and legal letters in plain English, and that caught on. I was quite impressed with how easy it was to read certain documents, particularly documents used by local councils and government that are meant to focus essentially on the member of the public who doesn't have access to a lawyer. I was, for example, very pleased when I was doing something online. It was essentially a probate application of all things, and it was, I thought, oh God, I'm going to have to go back to my trust law credentials, which, let's face it, are slightly ropey. I was never a big fan of trusts, but there we go. But I thought I'd have to go back to that. But no, everything was explained in an easy to understand format. And where there were things they thought you might need a lawyer to help, they would refer you to it and say who you should speak to, what sort of person would help you with each element that might be unclear. Here in Hong Kong, we're completely the opposite. Some of this is because laws tend to be focused on 2 or 3 different languages that they're translated into each, and there may be ambiguities between the two. Contracts, however, sometimes it seems like there's an attempt to just outwit people using language alone, regardless of how good someone's case is. And I do think that endangers justice. Now, there are groups here, I'm posting this on LinkedIn, there are groups on LinkedIn, but there are groups all over the place where people are favouring legal design, and I am seeing now clients, organisations, large organisations, trying to think of how they can convert some of their documents, their standard form documents, particular customer-facing ones, so terms of use, account opening provisions, essentially even a privacy policy, and make them become essentially a legal design document where it's pictorial, flowcharts, all very, very clear language. I think, for example, a privacy policy is probably the perfect example of what should be construed in that way, what should be created that way. But we've got a long way to go. I would like to know if this is something that you are interested in and if something you might like to get involved in. I think it would be something that would be quite cool to take, for example, a typical Hong Kong personal information collection statement and transform that into essentially a document that stops being a boring wall of text that nobody really reads and makes it very clear what's happening, what's being done, what data is being collected, and what's being done for. That's all a personal information collection statement has to do normally, but actually making it that you don't have to delve through reams of text to understand it. So I'm interested in what you think. If you're a lawyer, is legal design a disaster? Should we remain in our ivory towers being the only people with, I wouldn't say necessarily the intelligence to read through these documents, but perhaps the stamina? Or should we make it that everyone can understand everything that applies to them? Now, I very much think it's the latter, but I'm interested in your view. If you are a startup, a small business, or even if you're in a massive organisation, I'm curious what you think. Would you see your organisation move away from these very dry contracts to something that was much more accessible? I would assume most people would. Although that said, I've come across a few US lawyers who seem to relish in actually making things as complicated as possible. Apologies to you US lawyers, I'm not picking on you really, but you know what I'm talking about. But I do think it is the future. Ultimately, being a lawyer, being what we called officers of the court, we are there to make sure that justice is done. We're there to give the best, essentially the best advice to our client. And I often think that the best advice you can give to someone is advice that is easy to digest and easy to understand. On that positive note, I'm going to say farewell for now. I'll be back very soon. Very interested in your feedback, so make your comments below on LinkedIn, or if you're watching this on YouTube, then do it there as well, I suppose. You may as well. And do subscribe if you're on YouTube, that's always helpful. If there's any topics you'd like me to cover, do let me know. But I'll be back again very, very soon. I'm looking at the moment at Hong Kong, you probably guessed from the content of some of this video, Hong Kong's data privacy laws and whether they are fit for purpose. So maybe it'll be a Hong Kong focused video for next time. In the meantime, have a good one. I'll see you soon.